Good morning. My name is Matt Weidinger, and I'm the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to today's event called Combating COVID-19 Unemployment Fraud, a conversation with Representative Kevin Brady of Texas. Mr. Brady, welcome. Many thanks for joining us for today's event. Glad to have you with us.
Matt, thank you very much. Thanks to AEI and especially to you for hosting this conversation.
Delighted. Really appreciate your time. So I will do a brief overview and then turn it back over to you for your opening remarks in a few minutes, if that's okay. So with that, the COVID-19 pandemic ushered in a stunning growth in unemployment claims as the pandemic shuttered businesses and Congress offered unprecedented expansions and benefits to Americans who lost work. Those expansions included more than just the extended benefits that are typically offered to those exhausting state unemployment checks in recessions. They also included entirely new programs that continue to support millions of people who were never before eligible for unemployment benefits. The expansions also included large federal payments added on top of all other unemployment checks. Those started out as $600 per week supplements in March of 2020 and remain $300 per week today. These payments offer some recipients more in benefits than they would earn by returning to work, which many argue contributes to current near record job openings across the country. In response, over half of the states are now actually turning down these federal benefit expansions before they will otherwise expire everywhere on Labor Day. These expansions have offered generous assistance to Americans who lost work due to the pandemic, but they also created an enormous target for criminals here and abroad looking to rip off the system, which was already overwhelmed by literally tens of millions of added claimants. Loose program rules, including federal policies that allowed claimants to self-certify their eligibility, and state practices suspending anti-fraud measures contributed as well. It's anyone's guess how much has been lost. The estimates start at $80 billion. The 10% error rate before the pandemic for this program applied to the now roughly $800 billion in state and federal benefits paid since the pandemic started. But that's almost certainly low, given the fraud that we've seen. So, for example, California officials in January estimated that 27% of funds there may have been misspent. One expert who has been helping multiple states avoid these sorts of losses suggests the losses could reach as high as 50%, or a staggering $400 billion. If the losses are even half that much, unemployment fraud would qualify as the fourth largest stimulus program, bigger than the coronavirus relief fund for states and the cost of vaccine treatment and development combined. Given the importance of these benefits and those stunning numbers, some policymakers have not stood still. One example is my guest today, Representative Kevin Brady of Texas. He's the former chairman and the current senior Republican on the House Committee on Ways and Means, which has jurisdiction over unemployment benefits and taxes. Representative Brady worked with his colleagues to include some anti-fraud provisions in a December 2020 law extending these temporary benefits. And this past May, along with his colleague, Senator Mike Crapo, the lead Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, he introduced the Combating COVID Unemployment Fraud Act. That legislation proposes wide-ranging efforts to better understand how much has been lost, recover misspent funds, and prevent such losses from recurring in the future. Before I joined AEI in late 2018, I was privileged to work for then Chairman Brady on the staff of the Ways and Means Committee. It is a high honor to have him join us today. And everyone watching today should also tune in late September when he once again anchors the Republican team in the annual congressional baseball game for charity, which is another passion of his. So before we proceed, a couple of housekeeping items. After I turn it over to Representative Brady, we'll have a discussion about key issues involving unemployment fraud and benefits more broadly. We also appreciate everyone's tuning in today and welcome your participation as well. If you would like to submit a question that may be asked, you can email it directly to Jillian Wheeler at aei.org. That's JILLIAN.WHEELER@aei.org, or submit it on Twitter using the hashtag AEIOnPoverty. And with all that, we'll finish up by around 9:45. So with that introduction, let me now turn it over to Representative Brady for his opening thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Matt, again for helping educate policymakers and lawmakers on this issue. I think right now it is crucial that we focus on what is a historic and unprecedented multi-billion-dollar theft of taxpayer dollars and what Congress needs to do to address it right now. As you said, do the poorly designed COVID unemployment programs, and now really in action on behalf of Congress this session, we are experiencing the greatest theft of tax dollars in American history. You know, as you said, we closed down our economy, shuttered businesses, told workers to stay home because it was necessary, and Congress wanted to help the jobless. But these emergency programs lingered on far past the emergency and has now become one of the most flawed and wasteful efforts ever enacted by the federal government. And as an aside, I will tell you, I worry because looking at the agenda, I think Democrats in Washington are determined to spur even higher inflation and make it more difficult for the economy to recover with a dangerous expansion of the welfare state that ushers in a new era of government dependency, some of that tied to this unemployment program. As of today, we don't know how much of the taxpayer dollars have been lost in fraud to COVID unemployment programs, but outside experts estimate that criminal fraudsters have stolen hundreds of billions from American taxpayers. Hundreds of billions of dollars. And worse, they're continuing to do this as we speak. Every day, we see news stories with states across the country uncovering millions of dollars in fraudulent unemployment claims. And this is not a victimless crime. Unchecked fraud has delayed legitimate payments from being made and diverted funding away from unemployed jobless workers. It's also turned thousands of Americans into unwitting identity theft victims. And to make matters worse, this administration, along with Democrats in Congress, today are in total denial about this crisis. Republicans' requests for a joint hearing on fraud in the pandemic-era programs have fallen on deaf ears for months, while our letters to the Biden administration go unanswered. Earlier this year, congressional Democrats rejected numerous Republican amendments to the partisan $1.9 trillion spending COVID emergency bill that would have targeted relief and prevented fraud. Ways and Means Committee, we offered a simple amendment to ensure that states verify who you are and your wages before paying those unemployment benefits. That common sense amendment was unanimously struck down. And House Democrats have not had one single oversight hearing to investigate what is going on with this theft. It seems to me, and I don't understand the reason, the administration has no sense of urgency and no sense of priority on this issue. There is no doubt Congress needs to go after this criminal fraud and recover the dollars that have been lost. The bill that I introduced with Senator Crapo, the Combating COVID Unemployment Fraud Act, would do just that and focuses really on three solutions. It's about prevention, recovery, and protection. So first, we prevent fraud on the front end, prevent this from becoming an even bigger problem. Secondly, we help states recover and claw back fraudulently paid dollars, and then we protect and provide relief to victims of unemployment fraud and the identity theft that goes along with that. It's common sense to begin with stopping the pay and chase model of benefits by requiring, the identity verification, documenting prior earnings and employment, and putting in place digital identity proofing services. We need to make sure people are who they say they are before we give out benefits. It also establishes a COVID unemployment fraud task force to focus on recovery by clawing back dollars from criminals and increasing prosecution and finding out just how much has been stolen. We trade incentives for states to do exactly this, and resources. Finally, the bill provides relief to victims of unemployment fraud by setting aside resources and funding for these resource centers to assist them. Not only have these, in many cases, lavish unemployment benefits become an easy target for criminals, they are crushing Main Street hiring efforts and delaying our economic recovery. There's no question we've seen in the first half of the year, job growth has slowed from the last half of 2020. Economic growth beyond next year has now been revised downward, by almost 30%. The only thing that seems to be going up are wages, and in part because it is difficult for Main Street businesses and for our supply chains, for our manufacturers to find the workers to man the production lines. So we're seeing higher prices, slower deliveries, and frankly, real downward pressure on our economic growth. States, to their credit, some states are taking matters into their own hands. 26 Republican governors have chosen to stop participating in the federal unemployment bonus and return to their traditional state unemployment formulas. That makes sense because it recognizes regional differences in wages. We know that the paychecks in Cut and Shoot, Texas are different than paychecks in San Francisco. These Republican states predominantly recognize that difference. And so far, initial data has shown both the initial and the continuing weekly unemployment claims have decreased faster in states that stopped the federal bonus. The results speak for themselves. More people are going back to work. That is better for Main Street. It is better for those workers, certainly better for our economic recovery. I would say, too, these crises have been created or intensified, in my view, by President Biden's mismanagement of the economy. Inflation has been caused by massive government spending and the Biden administration paying people more to stay home than to work. If we want economic growth and we want Main Street businesses to survive, they need workers, and they need them now. This is a true failure of leadership. So to conclude, while a lot of issues get attention in Washington today, unfortunately, we are living through the greatest theft of American tax dollars in history. Congress has a responsibility to ensure COVID relief doesn't remain a windfall for fraudsters. We need to recover those precious tax dollars for our needs going forward. There's just too much at stake not to add. So, Matt, thank you for hosting this. I know we want to get into the conversation with others on the call today.
Thank you, Representative Brady, and thanks for those terrific comments, putting this all into context and the sort of bigger picture that Congress and you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Just a reminder to our audience that if anybody would like to submit a question, again, email it directly to Jillian Wheeler at aei.org, JILLIAN.WHEELER at aei.org, or submit it on Twitter using the hashtag AEIOnPoverty. So let's start just kind of taking a step back. How big of a problem is unemployment fraud in your view? And you know, we've talked a little bit about dollars and cents. The numbers are huge, but some of this goes to confidence in the system, subsidies for people's identities to be stolen. I mean, you know, this is a really big deal. What are your thoughts on sort of the overall picture of this?
In any other moment in history, this would be the biggest issue. In fact, as you were talking about the low end estimates of unemployment fraud, $89 billion from the Labor Department's Inspector General, that amount itself is staggering in scope. But outside experts, as you say, who work with these states indicate that that number may be as high as $400 billion. That's half of all of our COVID unemployment aid. It is more than the entire budget this year for the Army and the Navy combined. These are stunning numbers, and that's on top of the identity theft and the damage done there. It's on top of the damage done to the economy from workers who, you know, have no more incentive to reconnect to their job and to their business. So I think perhaps we start with that question as a Congress, which is, how big a crime is this? And why does no one federal agency have any responsibility for looking into this? The legislation I introduced with Senator Crapo requires the Labor Department to provide a report to Congress describing the total amounts of fraudulent payments nationally. In the meantime, we have been reaching out and asking GAO to do a government-wide investigation. So we better know the scope and the severity. That knowing how big this fraud is the first step. The second is determining how to stop it and how to recover.
Can you talk a little bit about when Congress started to become aware of how big of a deal this was, how major a problem this was, and what's Congress done about it so far?
Shortly after we did the initial CARES Act, where we're paying the $600 a week in federal unemployment on top of the state unemployment system, we immediately began to hear. First wave was hearing from our Main Street businesses who were desperate for workers. But then, a few months after that, we began to hear about the fraud. And I think really we began sounding the alarm last fall. That's why we put in place stronger protections in the December emergency COVID bill. In there, we required states get documentation of prior employment and earnings within 21 days of application, and included a phase-out period for those benefits. Unfortunately, those, I think, modest safeguards were rejected in the March COVID emergency bill. At the time, too, at the end of last year, we also helped provide reimbursement to states for contracting with outside vendors. We knew the states needed help in combating here. And again, if you verify who you are, your employment and the wages, you're going to win this battle. And we thought it was important for states to have the resources to go beyond just their existing, agencies to combat this. But it's been frustrating. That was the last concrete step Congress took, and it's now expired.
Right. So you took a look at that picture and you said, hey, more needs to be done. So you crafted this bill working with Senator Crapo that you introduced in May, and have talked a little bit about the various provisions in that, establishing identity before we start paying benefits, that sort of thing. What do you think is the most effective? Like, what are the couple of, most efficacious provisions in that bill that you've introduced?
It is, the solution's pretty common sense here. One is, stop this pay first and chase later model of government. Unfortunately, we don't even chase in the unemployment system, and do that before you give out the money, verifying identification, your employment, your wages before you start the benefits. Look, that solves this problem in a big way. The other is requiring better data matching to ensure payments don't flow to dead people, to prisoners, to people registering in multiple states. The good news is we've got the databases, we've got the technologies. The states don't yet have those connectors in place. Very important. We do that because while this does include some petty theft fraudsters, what we're really talking about are very sophisticated criminal organizations, foreign actors, prison inmates, hackers, identity thieves who've just seen, a gold mine here. And so we've really got to go all in on prevention here. And then, of course, recovering these dollars. It's a staggering amount. And as we look at Congress debating how we fund necessary infrastructure, look, here is, we keep turning a blind eye to up to $400 billion that, had we prevented it, could have been put to much better use. So I think those are the priorities on tackling this, and they're all doable, by the way.
Yep. So you talked a little bit about how some of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle are basically whistling past the graveyard on this issue, and the Biden administration really has not been aggressive on this issue. But it's not like everybody has not paid attention. So, for example, the Bipartisan infrastructure plan seems to count on what they expect to be $80 billion in savings from preventing unemployment fraud in the future. There have been people on both the left and right that have looked at that and said, yeah, it really seems unlikely to happen within the bounds of sort of the normal operation of the UI system. What are your thoughts on the bipartisan infrastructure plan, and specifically that, sort of possibility that they can extract those kind of savings?
Yeah, so we've really not seen, frankly, single Democrats step forward. And we thought we built this as a bipartisan effort because obviously there are needy people, and every dollar that we save, frankly, can go to those who truly need it. We really believed, wrongly, that this would be an easy bipartisan issue. It hasn't been. In the committee, Ways and Means committees, we've introduced amendments we thought would be accepted broadly, were rejected on party line votes. So there's been no interest in Congress here. And you asked a great question. I was encouraged when I first saw that draft of the Senate discussion that finally someone might be taking a hard look at this issue. But if you look closely, it looks more like an estimate of lost taxpayer funds and really an empty promise to recover it somehow, someday, with no real plan as we explored what they were going to fund to recover it, no real effective way to do this. So my sense is that this proposal is way too little, way too late, and I don't think it will be a pay for of any significance, unfortunately.
Yeah, this goes beyond our discussion today, but the way the Congressional Budget Office looks at the unemployment benefit system makes it really unlikely that the level of savings that some have supposed can be extracted will actually occur. So there's some serious sort of inside Congress, inside baseball sort of issues involved in that proposal. So just sort of thinking back, what are some longer term lessons you take from this pandemic experience with unemployment benefits? And just to kind of put this in context, all of this made some sense at the start, right? The $600 added on top of wages was designed to make the average worker whole. The federal government stepping in and instead of letting states wait a week to establish somebody's identity before paying out benefit checks, said, no, we're going to pay for that first week of benefits. So there was this rush to get benefits out the door, rush to provide bigger benefits that have had, they've been providing significant help for individuals, but at the same time, they created this target and this opportunity for fraud. What are some of those lessons that Congress should keep in mind, thinking about the future, thinking about the permanent operation of these programs, and also the next time we hit a recession or, God help us, pandemic?
Yeah. So to your point, I don't think at the outset this was intentional at all. This was unprecedented. We didn't know how much damage was being done. We wanted to keep those workers reconnected to their jobs through the PPP program. We wanted real help to people immediately who 20 million were jobless almost overnight in America in total. It was a response to that. But I think lessons learned, one, you should never have a policy that pays people more to stay home than to go back to work. And the damage, we are still seeing the economic damage from that policy today. While the 26 states, have returned to their state and local benefits, that's only about 40% of the workers in America. So, I think even the Congressional Budget Office, admits that we won't see stronger job growth till those federal bonuses go away. So policy one, create incentives to get people back and reconnected, not the other direction. Secondly, another lesson is, the federal government ought to focus on those state unemployment benefits. Those are attuned to the state's wages and wage rates. When the federal government comes up on top of it, we create serious distortions in the economy, and people are smart when they realize they're being rewarded to stay home on the couch rather than to reconnect at work. They'll do that. And the worry we all have is that if your decision is just to ride out the checks, just to ride that time out, the worry is, will that job you left and will that business you left still be there when you're ready to go back to work? And we worry about that in a big way. The other lesson learned here, obviously, is outdated technology really puts states at a disadvantage, especially when you need a fast pace to respond to something like what we hope will be unprecedented in the COVID pandemic. What we now know is that on top of that normal effort to defraud the government, these organized criminal organizations, internet hackers, foreign actors targeting, they reacted so quickly to what they saw as integrity loopholes in this process. They continue to do that today. So we're going to have a concerted partnership with the states. They're running our unemployment programs. They need to modernize from a technology standpoint, especially when it comes to detecting stolen identities. And again, Matt, there is not a problem here that isn't solvable if Congress would actually admit that there is a problem.
Yep. So just like you and others have sort of not been sitting still looking at the unemployment fraud side of things, other policymakers have said things like, in effect, hey, these pandemic benefits are really terrific. They're paying people more. We're paying more people than ever before. We're extending benefits for really long times. And some people look at that and say, you know, that's what we should do all the time. So some of your Senate colleagues, for example, have proposed legislation that would basically force states to do all of that. They would make, in effect, these pandemic-style benefits payable to more people for longer periods of time at higher levels. They would force that on states, which are, you know, basically the states are the foundation of this system. What do you think about that? I mean, basically the idea is to centralize more control over the system in Washington, D.C., as opposed to letting states understand their local labor markets and respond appropriately to help people both get benefits when they need them, but also get back to work when that's appropriate too.
Yeah, long run, those proposals are incredibly damaging to not just the economy, but to the workers themselves. To your point, unemployment is a state-based system. It reflects employment and wages in their state and their regions. We should not be centralizing control in Washington. We just saw, you know, what happens when you do this one-size-fits-all across the country. And while initially, I think, very helpful in the initial months of this pandemic, now has reversed itself into becoming a very damaging model of centralized control in Washington. The other point you make is that we risk ushering in a new era of government dependency right now. Clearly, because the benefits have been so generous, a new analysis by the Ways and Means Republicans show that Congress has already approved for a family of 4 where both parents lost their jobs. We've already approved $109,000 just in stimulus, unemployment, in children's benefits for them. There are proposals for a 4th stimulus check, a 5th stimulus check, permanent monthly income, and of course, the expansion of a number of welfare programs without a requirement to work in this new $3.5 trillion proposal. So all of these ideas to create a dramatically bigger welfare state in the United States risk moving us backward and risk moving us to a system where it is never-ending government checks with no urgency or requirement to return to work, to get that skill, to have your children see you work each day and understand the value of that. I think overall, that as big as this theft of dollars is, I think that future theft of self-sufficiency can be even more damaging, especially coming out of 2 years after tax reform. What we saw were a lot of people that had been left behind in the old tax code, in the old economy, now weren't. So we saw people coming off the sidelines to work. We saw wage gains and job opportunities among the poor. We looked at 6 million Americans out of poverty. We increased household income in 2019. The biggest surge in 1 year was more than all 8 years combined ahead of that. We drove poverty rates down, and we began to shrink income inequality, not by making Americans more dependent on the government, by creating better opportunities and rising paychecks. So I believe this approach, this expansion of the welfare state that is the current battle in Congress, I think is one is very important that we defeat those proposals.
Yep. And that, of course, is without even getting into the question of how the heck are we going to pay for all this, right? So the unemployment system is premised on, the state unemployment system is premised on employer payroll taxes going in, which economists look at and say, well, that's really workers sacrificing wages. The federal side of the system has been all deficit spending, right? So that's just basically future taxpayers going to have to pay more. We haven't identified who those people are, but for sure somebody's going to have to pay. So, all of this discussion so far has been, hey, let's do all these things and let's worry about how to pay for them later. Later is actually going to start arriving in states as early as next year when it comes to payroll tax hikes on businesses to pay for the state side of things. And the federal side, which is, several times larger than the state side has been in this episode, that's going to come down the line and hit people who have no idea who's going to be hit.
Yeah. To your point, Congress has really this year moved away from focusing on defeating the virus and rebuilding the economy, and it's more from the spending side. It is like college students on an extended spring break. It is party now, hangover tomorrow, and that hangover, we worry, is going to be serious. I think we're already seeing that in all this government spending, all these government programs. There's no question it is helping drive up prices. And so far, every month this year, inflation has exceeded wage growth by almost double. So families' paychecks are actually buying less in this first half of the year than they did when 2021 began. We worry too, how you pay back all of this. And when the federal government gets involved, they often get the incentives wrong, and that damage, I think, is showing itself right now, especially in the unemployment side. So there are real causes to worry.
So we're starting to get some questions from our viewers. Jay asks, how can Congress help states improve data matching across systems to help states prevent fraud when determining UI eligibility? I think this is the, sort of the mandate in effect in your bill to say states need to access these lists to make sure, you name it. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, the answer here. So in the first part of this bill on the prevention of fraud, we allow states to claim reimbursement, actually, to get paid back for these major investments on identity verification, including contracting with third parties, help them match this data to flag suspicious claims, including cross-state matching, using the Social Security Administration's prisoner database and the death master file. Those tools are out there. It is going to take technology investment, and we want to work closely with the states and are right now in what they need to have the right tools.
Yeah, and I would note some of it involves state will. So states like California before had systems that expected matching against prisoner databases elsewhere, and then they took those down in the interest of basically streamlining the system and getting benefit checks out the door. So some of it is literally states actually wanting to do the things that they know are successful to keep California taxpayers from paying benefits to prisoners in Florida and Massachusetts and elsewhere. So
I agree. States need to want to prevent this fraud. They need to want to take the steps that protect these taxpayer dollars, make sure it gets to those who truly need it. In Congress, I think, can play a role here. Again, I think in the rush of the initial emergency months, there was an understanding that there would be loss here as states reacted. But as we went farther through the emergency and into a little more of normal times, what we saw from states are dramatically different attitudes about prevention, about recovery, about verification. And even now, you're seeing a broad spread between the states that have made the decision to return to the state benefits and really help drive people back to Main Street in stronger economic recovery versus states that don't. In the states that have stopped the federal bonus, you are seeing a better response from workers, certainly stronger economic growth, certainly lower unemployment numbers, all which accrue to workers in a good way. So you're still seeing elements of the different wills in the states today.
Yep. So on that point about the different wills in the states, as you've described, there are about 26 states, including many Republican states, but also the Democrat governored state of Louisiana, that have said, hey, in the interest of getting workers back to work, we think we need to stop paying these extraordinary federal benefits. But in all the rest of the states, a lot of blue states and a handful of red states, those benefits are scheduled to come to an end around Labor Day, no matter what. It's really interesting to me, having lived with you all through a number of these crises, recessions, where Congress extends benefits, that basically there's very little discussion going on now about doing yet another extension come Labor Day. And this is as Congress is headed for its annual August recess, and as those programs will actually expire during that recess. So it's kind of noteworthy that there's not more groundswell on usually the left side of the spectrum for these sorts of expansions and extensions. What do you think is going to happen at Labor Day? You think this thing is just going to end and that's going to be it?
There are congressional Democrats here who aren't reading the room here in the country that are pushing for extensions, and some of them for permanence here. I think after many months denying that there was a problem, an impact, claiming these were just anecdotal issues about Main Street businesses and supply chain companies struggling to find workers. Both President Biden and Labor Secretary Walsh have both said these programs should be allowed to expire. I think they should be expiring right now to help the economy. Congressional Budget Office new projection here just recently shows that job growth will pick up and unemployment reduce when these benefits end. And I do worry, though, we've got these every month matters. Job growth in 2021 has slowed, which makes no sense because 2020 was brutal. And coming into the new year, we had everything lined up. Regions beginning to reopen, an economy that had recovered, had beat expectations. You had trillions in COVID spending and life-saving vaccines, every tailwind in a good way. But the first 6 months this year were actually 1,400,000 jobs short of what was created in the last 6 months of 2020. This unemployment program and the states that continue the federal bonus are contributing to that slower job growth in a big way. And the sooner they stop contributing that and helping reconnect, they'll see more of their small businesses, Main Street businesses survive, because right now there are, every member of Congress can tell you, there are a lot of businesses trying to decide, do they reopen? Do they continue? Can they survive on half staff? And it's worse in those states. I'm hopeful they come to their senses.
Okay, so another question from a listener, Ashley asks, what lessons have we learned from this experience to help shape future decisions and format future programs to keep fraud at bay?
I actually think, many of these issues we had been working on from the standpoint of the technology and the resources that states need. It just became so much urgent under COVID. I think those lessons, are put in place. Those integrity provisions really crucial. Make investments now on the technology. Require the data matching that makes sense. I'm hopeful Congress has learned a lesson that best intentions at the federal unemployment can have grave impacts at the state level. So, I'm hopeful we recognize if we ever see a crisis like this, we start at the state level, we help from that direction. But we've got a lot of work to do. And again, I'm optimistic that there's not a problem here we can't solve if we could just find some partners here in Washington to help us address this unprecedented theft.
And there seems to be some bipartisanship on that point, right? Like providing states with the tools necessary to administer the system better so that we prevent a recurrence from this. Hopefully we're never going to have a situation where we go from before the pandemic, 2 million people collecting unemployment benefits, low level, but typically low in recent years, up to as high as apparently 35 million people at least claiming benefits, some double counting and all that. So even Visa probably couldn't have handled that kind of surge in claims. So there is some bipartisan support for helping states to navigate that from an administrative side, right?
Yeah, yes, there is. I think there's enough to work off of there if we can get the attention now on this issue. The other thing I'm hoping we can find bipartisan support is in the value of work for those who are jobless for extended period. We've addressed as Republicans, passed this out of the House when I was the chairman, but we really need a modern welfare reform program that requires individual plans to help people get back to work, recognizing a check alone does not address the issues of families that are jobless for extended period that don't have skills. And I'm hopeful we can defeat this $3.5 trillion welfare state, because that really it removes the child tax credit away from the requirement to work, could have permanent unemployment at the federal level. I think does damage to our efforts to address poverty and opportunity in a serious way. So, I think this discussion on this unprecedented theft leads also, I think, to bigger discussions on how we continue to lift people out of poverty. And it is not for government Washington to become the Olive Garden of never-ending checks. That will not solve them and solve their problems. We're going to have to find smarter ways.
Right. And here too, this is another example of how some things made sense in the pandemic. So early on, Congress gave states the authority to waive the work search requirement that typically applies to unemployment benefits. You want to minimize contacts, you want to keep people from moving about. That makes sense if it's March 2020. Here we are in July 2021, and some states still have not restored that requirement. Others have brought that back online. But again, these programs should be about helping people go back to work instead of disincentivizing, in effect, not working and staying on benefits longer.
And I have to point out, because it's disappointing, that while President Biden has said people need to accept a job, his executive order from January is still in place that allows the unemployed to self-certify that they don't feel comfortable returning to work for health reasons or other reasons. That's created, and it forces states to provide unemployment benefits, even unverified, going forward. So I also think as we speak this morning, the administration is sending mixed signals to Americans about the urgency to accept a suitable job.
So, Representative, I want to be respectful of your time. We said 9:45, so I'm going to give you one last question. And I'd like to end on a positive note. So we've talked about historic theft, and we were talking probably hundreds of billions of dollars in losses to taxpayers through these systems, through their design, through criminal elements, possibly even other countries ripping off these programs. But let's take a step back and look at this from what might be positive from the standpoint of how Congress and the administration have reacted to this crisis. What have they gotten right in terms of the unemployment benefits response to the pandemic? Sort of recognizing that there's a lot that's gone wrong. What has happened that has been helpful in your view?
I'm confident the initial response to COVID, especially in the CARES bill, it was fast, it was bipartisan. Programs got stood up in record time for a record emergency. And I think Congress together, when both parties work together, I think we saved a lot of jobs. We saved a lot of businesses, small businesses. We accelerated testing and vaccines, and I think kept our eye on defeating the virus and at that time just saving the economy. Since then, I think Congress has drifted away from that. While there are silver linings, I think, in COVID, certainly, our opportunity for telehealth, our now opportunity to become medically independent from China on crucial medicines, medical supplies, and ingredients. On unemployment, the curtain's been pulled back. We now know the weaknesses of this system, both from reconnecting workers and from this unprecedented fraud. All of these are solvable problems, and I think for the viewers with us today who look for opportunities for common ground among Republicans and Democrats, this fraud in the unemployment system is just, I think, perfect for both parties, putting our shoulder to it together. I really think, I'm absolutely confident we can do some good things together here. Yeah, we're fully capable of this. We need to make this an issue people will address.
Well, on that optimistic note, and I would note as an aside, you're an optimistic guy, and I really appreciate that perspective and all the time you've given to us today. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to our audience for listening in. I know they will be, like us, watching very closely to see how Congress and the administration navigate these important issues in the weeks ahead. So again, thank you, Representative Brady, for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt. Take care. Let's keep working together.
You bet.